Hey, storyteller, why do you tell stories? For the one you're working on right now, what's your ultimate goal? Ask 100 writers that question and you'll get almost that many answers. But there's one goal we all share: hook readers and keep them turning pages. But how? Is there some secret formula or ninja technique we can use to grab readers' attention from the very first page and never let go? Well, whether you write fiction, memoir, or nonfiction that uses stories to make its point, the secret boils down to this: you need to make readers feel like they're part of the story. Welcome to this week's writer coaching session, where you'll discover the secret weapon, a method designed to immerse readers in your story so well they'll feel like they're living the adventure with your characters. Hi, I'm Bridget from B Squared Writer Coaching. I'm an author, editor, and your story coach, here to help you make your story powerful, polished, and publishable, so you can move readers and help them experience your character's journey with maximum emotional impact. First, I have a gift for you just for visiting my channel: the ultimate guide to dialogue punctuation. One of the quickest ways to pull readers into your story and create a connection with your characters is to use compelling, clear dialogue. The thing is, if your character's words, thoughts, and halting or interrupted conversations are not punctuated correctly, you can confuse readers. And if you confuse them, you lose them. I know, grammar rules can be confusing and often contradictory. That's why I created this simple guide that will help you know where to put all the commas, periods, quotation marks, dashes, so the readers can focus on the emotions behind your characters' conversations, not get hung up on the words on the page. Just click the link in the description to download your copy or visit b2writercoaching.com. That's the letter B, the number 2, writercoaching.com. Print or save the dialogue guide as a quick reference, and you'll never have to search through those confusing dialogue grammar rules again. Also, be sure to watch the video until the end so you can get this week's Power Up, a super practical action step you can use right now in the scene you're working on. No matter the genre, readers want to get inside a character's head. They want to not only be told what the character feels, thinks, or experiences, but they want to live those feelings and experiences with the character. To accomplish this, we can use a method called deep point of view. We'll talk about what that is, along with a couple other terms that we need to know in order to understand how to use deep point of view. And then I'll share several tips with you on things that you can do and things that you should avoid in order to create deep point of view in your stories. In order to use deep point of view, we need to first understand what just plain POV or point of view is. The dictionary defines point of view as the mental position through which a story is observed or narrated. It's basically the lens through which the reader experiences the story. This involves the character who's telling the story in a particular scene, and it also involves what tense the story is told in, so whether it's past or present tense, the person that is used, not the character, but what we mean by that is first person or third person. So first person is when you use pronouns like I, me, and my to refer to the characters. Third person is when we use pronouns like he, she, and they. I'm not really going into second person because that's where we use pronouns like you, your, and that is used more in choose your own adventure stories or instruction manuals, actually. So it's very rarely used in fiction. If you'd like to know more about point of view, I could make a video on that topic if you're interested in that. So just let me know in the comments if that's something that you'd like to see. The character who tells the story in a particular scene is called the viewpoint character. A story can have either just one viewpoint character throughout the whole story or several. Especially in the romance genre, you'll often see the female protagonist, her point of view, and then in another scene or another chapter, you might see the male protagonist's point of view. Often in longer books like science fiction and fantasy, you can see multiple viewpoint characters. An author might choose to do an entire chapter from one character's point of view, or they may alternate scenes within the same chapter with different characters. The really important thing to remember, though, is that in any particular scene, You can only have one viewpoint character. So if you need to switch point of view, switch to a different character, you need to switch scenes. With that out of the way, what is deep point of view? When you use this method, the reader feels like he or she becomes the viewpoint character through that character's actions, thoughts, body language, internal responses. There are lots of techniques we can use to create this. The important thing to remember really is that deep point of view takes away the sense that there's an invisible narrator who creates kind of a barrier between the reader and the viewpoint character. In writer circles, especially among fiction writers, you'll often hear the term show, don't tell. Deep point of view is sort of the ultimate mastery of that technique. And it's very useful in not only fiction, but when we're writing memoir or if we're using stories in our nonfiction to connect the reader with our subject matter. Now let's get into how we exactly create deep point of view. Each of the tips I'm going to share with you could be a video on its own. So let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a whole series on deep point of view, and I can go into depth on some of these more. Also in the comments, let me know which topic you'd most like to learn more about. Now let's get into the things that we can do to create deep point of view. Tip number 1 is a classic example of show, don't tell. And what I mean is we're going to show the character's emotions, not tell the reader what the character feels. So imagine you're reading a story and the author says the character felt sad. Well, you might think, oh, well, but you don't really feel sad with the character. So how can we help the reader to feel the emotions with our characters? We can use things like body language, internal physical responses, the character's thoughts, and even specific metaphors that are related to the character's experience and subtext. So what do I mean by body language? Body language can be anything that the character does with his or her own body to express emotion. So like if a character is nervous, she might wring her hands or bite her nails or clutch at her clothing, maybe wad her sweater up into her fist. A male character who's nervous might grip the back of his neck and things like that. So they're little actions that a character may do even without thinking about it. This can also include facial expressions. So an angry character may glare at somebody, or his mouth might form a thin line, like how you're scowling. So any of those actions or facial expressions that a character may do to express emotion. And this can be the viewpoint character or any other character that the viewpoint character can see. So if it's someone behind the viewpoint character, he or she isn't going to know what that body language is. But as long as that viewpoint character can see what the other character is doing, you can use the body language to convey emotions, even in characters who aren't the central focus of the scene. Now, things like thoughts and internal physical responses, those can only be used for the viewpoint character. So what do we mean by internal physical responses? Those are the things that your body does within. Involuntary responses, like her throat constricted, maybe if a character is afraid or sad, and on the verge of tears. A character's eyes might burn, or her stomach flips, or a chill ran down his back, something like that. Those are all internal physical responses that can help us convey emotion. But like I said, this can only be for your viewpoint character because we're not in the head of anybody else in the scene. For tip 2, we need to use character-centric narration. And what this means basically is all the words that are not dialogue, the things we describe, the actions, it's all called narration. And what we want to do is to have all of the narration in the story be written as if from the perspective of your viewpoint character. So use words and phrases and descriptions and comparisons that this character would actually use. For example, if your character walks up to a building and is looking up this building, if the character is a construction worker, he or she is going to describe that or think about that building in a much different way than if the character is an artist. So think about your character's background and education and occupation and even social class and all of those things, and use words and phrases and comparisons that character would actually use when speaking or thinking. Because really, when we're when we're creating deep point of view, every word in the scene is seen from the perspective of that viewpoint character. Tip number 3 is to keep the story and the characters active by using powerful verbs. And powerful verbs are verbs that are active and descriptive. For example, you could say a character went across the street. Well, how? Did he teleport? Did he ride a bicycle? Did he walk? How did he get across the street? Now, we could say he walked across the street, and that walked is an active verb. Went is just kind of passive. He got there some kind of way. We don't know how. But if we say he walked across the street, at least we know where he's walking, but we don't know anything about his mood, his emotions, his physical state. Is he just out for a stroll? So is he strolling across the street? Is he sauntering because he's either arrogant or he's happy about something? Is he shuffling? Maybe he's an elderly person or he's injured, so he's shuffling across the street. If he's exhausted, maybe he trudged across the street. So you can see how just changing one little verb can make a huge difference in the mood of the scene and how the reader experiences what the character's emotions are, and like I say, even their physical state. If they're tired, or like maybe a kid who's full of energy would be skipping across the street. So you can really convey a lot through a simple verb that is both active and descriptive. A little bit later on, when we talk about things to avoid, we'll talk about the opposite of this, which would be weak verbs, and how that can really take a reader out of the story. So just stay tuned for that. For tip number 4, we want to use what I call active description. Have you ever run across we're reading a story and things are moving and the action's, really good, and then suddenly the story stops to describe either a character or a place, and the forward motion of the story just hits a wall, stops dead. An example of this would be, let's say it's historical fiction, and your character is going to an inn for the first time. She's never been anywhere outside of her home or whatever. So she goes to this inn and she's stepping into the room, and suddenly you stop and the author describes all the objects in the room. So maybe there's an old-fashioned pitcher and wash basin on a stand, and then there's a really nice quilt on the bed, and I don't know, just whatever the objects are in the room. Well, the story has halted. So when you take a whole paragraph to just describe the objects in the room, you've left your character standing in the doorway doing nothing. She's not thinking, she's not moving. In fact, she's disappeared altogether during that paragraph, and the plot has completely stopped. And so the reader is just left, okay, so we're looking at this room. We might even forget that the character exists for a moment. A better way to do this is to have your character interact with those objects in the room, and that's how we describe them. So instead of stopping in the doorway and doing nothing, she walks over to that pitcher and basin and pours water into the basin and washes her face because she's been traveling. Or maybe if you want to call attention to the quilt on the bed, maybe the character walks over to the bed and runs her fingers along the intricate stitching in the quilt and thinks, wow, it's so fancy, it's like too fancy to sleep under, or something like that. You can use those kinds of things, the characters interacting with those objects. Maybe she hangs her cloak on the hook next to the door, and that's how we know there is a hook on the door. If you want to describe a non-viewpoint character physically, like their hair color, you could have the character push her brown hair behind one ear. And if the viewpoint character sees this, that's how you can get a description of the character's hair color if you need it for whatever reason. So those are just a few small examples of how to weave description into the action of your story. Use the character's actions to call attention to and describe an element that you need the readers to know about. Also, just a little tip here too, just as a bonus, you don't have to describe every single detail. We don't need to know the character's hair color, eye color, height, weight, skin tone, unless it's significant to the plot of the story. You can give a little bit of description here and there, maybe like the hair is flecked with gray, and that gives us an indication that the character is older or something. But just leave a lot to the reader's imagination, because storytelling is only part our job. The other part is the reader's job. And that's one of the joys of storytelling, of reading stories. Tip number 5 is to keep all the events, including the tiny events, in chronological order. What I mean by this, well, big events, of course, that makes sense, right? You want things to happen in chronological order because anytime the reader has to backtrack in her mind, it takes her out of the story. It kind of kills that illusion that she's living the story with the characters and reminds her that someone's telling the story to her. When we talk about the tiny, tiny events, what I'm thinking about here is more like cause and effect. You want always the cause of something to come before the effect because that's how things happen in real life. I'll give you an example just to make this a little clearer. Let's say a character cringed when a dog barked. That's backwards. We need to put the dog barking first because that's the cause of the cringing. The cringing is a response or a reaction to dogs barking. So we want to keep that in chronological order. First, the dog barks, then the character cringes. Even though they might seem to happen almost simultaneously, always put the cause before the response, the motivation or stimulus, you can call it different things, before the reaction, and keep those things in order. Because like we say, if the reader has to mentally backtrack even that much, even if you have like she cringed when the dog barked, well, the reader is more aware that she's reading a story and not living it. Now we're going to talk about the things we need to avoid in order to create deep point of view. But first, if you're finding this helpful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click the bell for notifications so that you won't miss the next writer coaching session. One thing to note that is related to several of the tips on things to avoid when creating deep point of view is this. In any given scene, we can only show what the viewpoint character thinks, knows, or experiences, not anybody else. And we can't show things that he or she doesn't know or experience. The next tip will explain that in more detail. Tip number 6 is do not try to show anything that your viewpoint character doesn't notice or isn't aware of. For example, if I'm your viewpoint character and there's a door behind me, I would not know if a character snuck in through the door because my back is turned, right? So you wouldn't say something like she didn't notice a man sneaking in the door behind her. If she didn't notice it, neither can the reader. This is also true for a character's own reactions to things. For example, a viewpoint character isn't going to know that her own eyes lit up or that her cheeks flushed. She may feel her cheeks heat, but she's not going to know that the color of her face changed. You can assume that the color changed, but she isn't seeing that in herself, and she's not going to see her eyes flashing. If you want to show that, you would have to be in a different character's point of view. Tip number 7 is a little bit related to that. It's to avoid describing things in a way that the viewpoint character would not. For example, if a character's mom walks into the room, the character is going to think of that person as her mom, not as Jessica. She may call her mom by her first name in sort of a defiant type thing, but she's going to think of her as her mom because that is the relationship that the character has. Also, a character will not think about her own hair color, for example. You wouldn't describe her as pushing her brown hair behind one ear. You would she pushed her hair out behind one ear or something like that because we don't think about our own hair color unless we are, changing it or we took a photo and we noticed that our hair blended in with the background. There's got to be a specific reason why we would focus on the color of our hair. But in general terms, we just don't think in terms of that. So just keep in mind that those kinds of things when you're writing your descriptions in your scenes. The next 3 tips on things to avoid when creating deep point of view relate to words that either create or lead to telling. These 3 types of words create a barrier between the reader and the viewpoint character, and that is definitely not what we want. So tip number 8 is to avoid weak verbs, especially state of being verbs and helping verbs. And state of being verbs are forms of the verb to be. So things like is, am, are, was, were. Now, what I mean here is not just to avoid using those words altogether because they are necessary as helping verbs. For example, in the sentence, I was talking to my mom when the phone went dead. Well, you need the verb was because it goes with was talking because I'm not talking right now. I'm saying I was talking in the past. So those kinds of verbs can be used to create a sense of the tense, to change the tense of the main verb. What I mean here is not to use state of being verbs as the main and only verb in a sentence. Something like he was tired, for example. That's telling. We don't feel his tiredness with him, whoever he is, as your character. So you want to say something like he slumped in his chair and sighed, or he didn't have the strength to take another step, or every step was agony, something like that. That lets us know he's tired or he was in pain without telling. We're showing in that case. Another type of weak verb to avoid is helping verbs like have, has, or had. Again, you can use these with other verbs to help strengthen or create emphasis, or change the tense of the sentence, but using them alone as the main verb of the sentence creates weak sentence structure. So an example would be like, she had too much left to do. That's telling, and we don't feel the stress that she's feeling with that sentence. So you could do something like, she looked down at the list, 20 items still not checked off. She sighed and rubbed her eyes. How was she going to get everything done? Something like that. That's much stronger. Tip number 9 is to avoid using ly adverbs. Well, why would we want to avoid ly adverbs? I mean, they do tell how things are done, right? Well, yeah, but they're telling. They also can be telling in terms of emotion as well. So like, if a character shouted angrily, like, why did you do that? He shouted angrily. Or what do you think you're doing? He shouted angrily. Well, if he's shouting, and based on the dialogue, the words he spoke, and the fact that he's shouting, we pretty much can guess he's angry. So we could just cut angrily. But if you really want to drive the point home, you can use body language and action. So, what do you think you're doing? He slammed his fist on the table. Or actually, I would have him slam the fist on the table and then say, what do you think you're doing? But that's a stylistic choice. So basically just avoid ly adverbs. Instead, substitute them, either just cut them. A lot of times you can just cut them and you're fine. Or you could substitute them with actions and body language, facial expressions, things like that. Have him glare if he's angry, something like that. Or use one of those powerful verbs, active descriptive verbs instead. And tip number 10, the third type of telling words to avoid is what we call filter words. Filter words really create a barrier between the reader and the viewpoint character and remind the reader that she's actually reading a story, that someone's telling her this. Some examples of filter words are things like wondered, thought, felt, saw. And that doesn't mean that those are always to be avoided, but in certain cases, they do create a barrier. For example, she wondered why he wasn't home yet. Well, that's telling, and we don't feel like we're wondering too. We don't feel any of her stress over it either. So a better thing to do is, instead of using wondered, actually rephrase that into the question she's wondering. Make her ask the question, even in her thoughts. Why wasn't he home yet? Had something happened? You see, now we're starting to feel her stress. Another example is the word felt. Saying a character felt tired, that's sort of similar to the weak verbs, he was tired. Another example of using felt would be something like, he felt a chill run down his back. Okay, well, yeah, we get that, there's something bad going on here, but a better way to say it is just to cut the felt part and just a chill ran down his back. Now, the reader feels her skin prickle as well. It's like you can feel the chill too. And so you just want to not have that barrier between. We don't need to tell the reader he felt it. The key with filter words is, especially ones that relate to the senses, is to remember that everything in the scene is happening through the perspective of that viewpoint character. So the reader knows that if there's anything that's described visually, that your viewpoint character is seeing it. If anything physical or sensation, is being described, the character's feeling it. So there's no need to say felt or smelled or saw. Another example of this is, the kitchen smelled wonderful and made her stomach rumble. Okay, well, we do have some body language going on. Well, we have some internal physical response going on right there, right? So that's good. Her stomach rumbled. But the kitchen smelled wonderful. How did it smell wonderful? What kind of wonderful? Are we talking, spicy or sweet or flowery? What does it smell like? We have no idea. So it really isn't even that descriptive. A better way to do this would be to show it through descriptions of the actual smells. As she opened the kitchen door, warm, moist air brushed across her face, carrying the scents of fresh baked bread, spices, and something sweet. Her stomach rumbled. Okay, guys, I don't know about you, but now I'm hungry. And tip number 11 is to avoid big chunks of either description or backstory or information. We call these dumps, backstory dumps, information dumps. And what that's like, if you're reading along and the story's progressing and you get to this paragraph and it's all about what happened in the character's past, or it's a bunch of information. This happens especially in technical books with technical information or science fiction and fantasy. Sometimes people will do this dump of information about the technology or the magic system or whatever. And the thing is, readers get bored. It stops the plot cold, just like we were talking about earlier with the stopping to describe a room. Same principle here. You're stopping the forward motion of the current story to give us a glimpse into the character's past or to give us information that we need. Now, the information might be necessary to the plot, but there are other ways to get that information to your reader. You want to use little breadcrumbs, little nuggets of information sprinkled throughout, either in dialogue or revealed through action. There are lots of ways to do this. But also be careful and don't just put an entire information dump in dialogue and disguise it as dialogue. Keep in mind that characters are not going to tell each other what one character won't tell another character what they already know. A huge chunk of information in dialogue will also feel the same way. It'll feel like the reader will want to skim it or skip it. It doesn't seem natural. And so if you can use dialogue to reveal these things, even backstory, but you want to do it in small pieces and make it feel natural to the story. Speaking of dialogue, if you haven't done so already, be sure to download your Ultimate Guide to Dialogue Punctuation so you can create reader-grabbing conversations for your characters. Just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com. Now for today's power-up. Each week, I will share practical action steps you can take related to what we've talked about in our writer coaching session. I don't know about you, but I get super frustrated when I'm watching videos or reading articles about writing and it's all a bunch of theory and fluff and not a whole lot of how to do the thing. So that's why I want to make sure these action steps at the end of every video are things you can actually take and use in your writing right now. For today's power up, either in the scene you're working on right now or in the most recent one that you've finished, identify who the viewpoint character is for that scene. Then check your descriptions and narration to make sure that you're using words, phrases, metaphors, comparisons that fit what that viewpoint character would think or say. If you find that you're having trouble figuring out which words or phrases your viewpoint character might use or how to make that character sound unique, be sure to join me next week for our writer coaching session where we'll talk all about how to create a unique voice for your characters. So remember, hit the notification bell and the subscribe button so you won't miss it. Be sure to let me know in the comments how I can help you. Let me know what topics you'd like me to cover in a future video on the writing craft or anything else you're struggling with in terms of writing. This is the first video in the Power Up Your Story playlist, where I'll share more tips like the ones you have heard today on how to ramp up your story. So just click the link up here, and especially if you're watching this in the future. Right now, this will be the only video in the playlist, but in the future, that playlist will have lots of good information for you. Until then, use the tips and techniques that I've shared with you today, and let's power up your storytelling.